Okay, we are in chapter 15. We're talking about the Canaanite woman. She says that my daughter is cruelly demon-possessed. So here is a Gentile woman that is able to see clearly enough and have enough faith and believes that Jesus could, in fact, cast the demon out of her daughter. The disciples want Jesus to send her away, do what she asks so that she will leave us alone. But he answered and said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus' purpose in coming was not to minister to Gentiles. And so that's why we're able to say that the disciples wanted him to deal with her and then she would go away. If all they were asking was for Jesus just to send her away, he would not have replied like he did. He goes on to say, or in verse 25, but she came and began to bow down before him. Now the New American Standard translators have made a choice and not a good one. This is proskuneo. She is not paying homage to him. She is proskuneoing him. She's worshiping him, and your footnote probably will indicate that it actually does mean worship. Saying, Lord, help me. And he answered and said, it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, in the years I've been in ministry and the sermons that I've heard, there have been a number of preachers and Bible class teachers that have said that Jesus insulted the woman. He's calling her a dog. Well, you need to understand that Jesus is most certainly not insulting her. He is not calling her a dog. But what he is doing is he's drawing an illustration from domestic order. I'm serving the children of Israel. I was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. It is not my ministry purpose to help those that are outside of my ministry purpose. And so he's saying to her, just like when a family sits down to eat, the dogs don't eat first, the dogs eat later. And while the meal is in progress, well, that's the way it works. Notice in verse 27, she is not insulted. So those that say that Jesus is calling her a dog, first of all, he's not. Second of all, she didn't take it that way either. She got his illustration to the extent that she is now going to draw upon the illustration and say, yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table. While the meal is in progress, occasionally something will fall from the table, and the dogs that are at the foot of the table will be able to eat what falls down. Now, with my kids, it was amazing how the broccoli and the peas would find a way off the table. It just was amazing. Never in all the years that I raised kids did dessert fall off the table. Never happened. But it's got a gravity to it. Apparently, the broccoli does not. Yes.
Do you think she actually understood that he was saying, you Gentiles will be handled later?
Yeah, I think she got that. So her point is, while the meal is in progress and serving the children, I get it. I'm not one of the children of Israel. I get that. But is there a possibility that a crumb could drop from the table?
Or maybe just get a room.
Being that I believe at this time the Canaanite people were cursed, did they know that through Jewish?
That they were cursed?
Well, in the book of Genesis, it, Shem's sons were, it says that they were cursed, the first people. Did they realize that, or?
They wouldn't have seen that themselves that way, and probably wouldn't even known what the Old Testament text had to say about non-Jewish nations and so on. So all she knows is Jesus is a healer, and he's able to do this. And you can feel this woman's pain to have a daughter that is in such a terrible state. And I've worked on this a little bit, I studied a little bit. She doesn't just say my daughter is demon possessed, it's cruelly demon possessed. And what that means is that the demon possession is doing things to hurt her. In Mark chapter 9, we have a boy that is demon possessed, and the demon in him is constantly trying to throw him into the fire or into the water to destroy him. So demons would do that. And the legion that we read about in Mark chapter 5, he's beating himself, he's cutting himself, he's hurting himself.
Going back to something you said earlier when we talked about the casting of the spirit into swines and how the only way people were saying that they would kill them was through drowning them. So that wouldn't really fit with what's happening in Mark 9, where that spirit was throwing him into the water to drown him.
It would fit because it's almost a kamikaze. Because I destroy me, I destroy him with me. And that still fits my purpose. So if he throws him in the water, he knows that he's committing demonic suicide. But does that make sense?
Depressed.
Yeah. He wasn't feeling too good.
All I have to look forward to is hell. I mean, come on.
Yeah. His demon days have got to pull me down. He just wasn't feeling good about it. All right. Then he answered and said to her, O woman, your faith is great. She responded with logic. She responded with faith. And Jesus says, your faith is great. The only other time in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus compliments faith was with another Gentile. It's sad that that's the way it is, but that's the way it is. He said, be it done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed at once. Now, again, like we learned in the miracle chapters, in chapter 8, Jesus has power over the demonic world, but he's got power over time and space. How far was this daughter from where Jesus was? Well, it might have just been right over there, or it might have been some distance. It didn't matter, because Jesus said, she's well, and she was immediately. Verse 29, and departing from there, he went along the Sea of Galilee, and having gone up to the mountain, probably the Sermon on the Mount is being referred to there, although we really don't know for absolute certain. Great multitudes came to him, and bringing with them those who were lame, crippled, blind, dumb, and many others, and they laid them down at his feet, and he healed them. So, 7th healing section in the Gospel of Matthew. Again, we're not looking at the individual stories, although we would love to. And in eternity, that's one of the things I'd like to do, is to be able to relive every story of the marvelous healings of Jesus. The crippled, how cool would that be? The lame, watching them jump up and walk again. The blind being able to see. The dumb being able to hear. It's just amazing what's going on, or being able to speak. And the multitude marveled as they saw the dumb speaking, the crippled restored, the lame walking. They marveled. Amazing, astonishing, what we're witnessing. The blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. So as with the others, not a solitary failure, not even one. And it didn't matter what the problem was. Blind, no problem. Dumb, no problem. Lame, got it covered. Then in verse 32, Jesus summoned to himself his disciples and said, I feel compassion for the multitude. Now I mentioned in chapter 14, and I repeat now, the compassion of Jesus is theologically significant. Now, it's significant at one level just because it brings us more into the nature and character of Jesus. He is compassionate. But what would you say, because I really didn't run down this road, I was waiting until now, is theologically significant about Jesus being compassionate?
This may not be right, but I'm wondering, is there a connection between all the times Jesus said, you don't understand, I desire compassion, not sacrifice, to the Pharisees?
He's practicing what he preached, Hosea 6:6. I desire compassion, and Jesus is demonstrating compassion. Now, 2 times in the Gospel of Matthew, what chapter is it? Can anybody name one of the 2 times that he quoted from Hosea 6:6, I desire compassion and not sacrifice?
Chapter
12.
12 is one. What was the earlier one?
Good practice for the casting.
Yeah, good practice.
Oh, chapter,
Besides, I do ask you.
chapter 9.
Chapter 9,
9.
Healing of a withered hand.
Yeah, 9 and 12 are the 2 places. And so now it's theologically significant because Jesus is practicing compassion. Now, when it comes to Denny, and I think of all of my problems, all of the times I've messed up, all the times that I have sinned against God, I need Jesus to look at me and not be mad, but be compassionate. Don't you? Yeah, am I the only one in this boat? But Jesus looks with compassion on people. And that's the way he would look upon you and me. All right, he felt compassion because they have remained with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. 3 days without food. You're feeling a little weak, aren't you, Jacob, after 3 days?
A little more than usual, yeah.
Yeah, more than usual. Now, Jesus promised in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 6, that one's physical needs would be supplied by God if they're seeking first his kingdom. And Jesus is here going to accomplish that promise personally. And the disciples said to him, where would we get so many loaves in a desert place to satisfy such a great multitude? Now, this is one of those questions that we ask when we're going through the Gospel of Matthew, and that is, wasn't it like just the last chapter you fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish? And now the disciples are going, what are we going to do? How on earth are we ever... It's like, I don't get that. But they themselves, first of all, they saw Jesus have the multitude follow him for 3 days without feeding them. Second of all, they themselves were used to going without. And so to anticipate or to expect a miracle was not the norm. What the norm was not to have Jesus miraculously produce bread. Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? They said 7 and a few small fish. So they've got more loaves and maybe a couple more fish than last time. And he directed the multitude to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and giving thanks, as was Jesus' custom, he broke them and started giving them to the disciples, and the disciples in turn to the multitude. Now, have you ever thought about the logistics of the way Jesus did this? He took the bread, broke it, blessed it, then broke it, but then it was the job of the disciples to hand it out. Now, you could look at that from one level and say it was purely logistics. How are you going to feed what's going to end up being 4,000 men in a somewhat organized, orderly, systematic way? Well, let's just, here, I'll give you some, and you hit over there, and you hit over there. But can you think of another benefit to giving it to the disciples and having the disciples give it to them?
Goes back to the lesson we heard Sunday night. I mean, sons of encouragement. It could have been to encourage his apostles. It could have been to show them that they are going to be servants.
Okay.
By including them.
That's a good application. Yeah, that'd be kind of a cool thing to be able to help somebody. I'd be encouraged. I'm seeing Jesus work a miracle firsthand. And what else? What about the perspective of the people to whom Peter is handing them the bread and the fish? What are they going to remember about that day? A connection with Peter or with Andrew. And so later on, when Peter is trying to feed them spiritual food, they're going to remember, he's the guy that fed me on the mountain that one day up in Canaan. And I'm talking about, if you're not following, credibility. Credibility. They were known to have been with Jesus. They were witness to the miracle. They benefited from the miracle. They ate the food that was miraculously produced. And they saw Peter, they saw John give it to them.
It just reminds me of one of my favorite Old Testament stories where God tells Moses, "You tell them they're going to get meat for a whole month and it's going to come out their nose." And Moses responds the same way as the apostles do. Where are we going to get that? Where are we going to get that much meat? It's like Moses had just seen all the miracles, and yet he was doubting. And so God just says, "My hand's not short." It just reminds me of that.
Yeah.
It's just cool.
It's easy to have no faith. And that's a warning, I think, for us. Because even in our lives, we're so used to taking care of things ourselves that relying on God is something we need to remind ourselves to do. All right. So we've got the feeding of the 4,000. According to verse 38, those who ate were 4,000 men, beside women and children. Now that's exactly the same terminology as we saw with the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 14 and verse 21. Now what I didn't point out there, but I'll point out here, is that the Greek can actually read that there were 4,000 men, or in that case 5,000 men, without women and children. Now, this is typically interpreted, and maybe incorrectly so, that we had 5,000 men, and then we had an equal number of women, and then maybe an equal number of children. So really, it's not the feeding of the 5, it's the feeding of the 15. Or in this case, not the feeding of the 4, but the feeding of the 8, or the feeding of the 12,000. But did you know, and think about this, that it's possible that all that's being fed were 4,000 men, without there being any women or little kids? We got a lad that's there that we read about, but he could still be a teenager. Now, if that's the case, what would you say about 5,000 men only following Jesus?
Get ready to form an army.
They're forming an army. Martha, you need to stay home. Stay home with the kids. But we're going out with Jesus. Just a little food for thought. This could be an army coming together. It also says that they ate and were satisfied, and that there was more than enough. All important concepts in the Gospel of Matthew. Just with miracles, so also with the feeding of the crowds, the 5,000 and 4,000. Everybody is satisfied. There's nobody leaving saying, well, I'd like to have had another biscuit, but... Or, my fish was a little overdone. What was yours? Everybody was satisfied.
I just assumed it was raw fish.
Raw fish. Probably was. And it was underdone then. Dismissing the multitudes, he got into the boat and came to the region of Magadan. Magadan is on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. Chapter 16. And the Pharisees and Sadducees came up and testing him, asked him to show them a sign from heaven. Now, if you write in your Bible, you might underline or mark the from heaven. Now, what is significant about that? Because they believe that only God can do stuff up there. If it's being done in the sky, then it's in the heavenly realm of God. And God is not going to let Satan do anything on his turf, so to speak. Satan can do stuff on the ground, that's okay. But up here, that's God's domain. So, show us a sign from heaven. But he answered and said to them, when it is evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, there will be a storm today, the sky is red and threatening. You know how to discern the appearance of the sky, but cannot discern the signs of the times. So they could read the weather, but they could not the obvious signs by Jesus. Jesus is not going to do more. If those that have been done are accomplishing no good whatsoever. Somebody's too blind to see the ones that have already been given, why give them more? So he tells them, an evil and an adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and a sign will not be given, except the sign of Jonah. Remember back in chapter 12, he talked about the sign of Jonah. What, Albert, is the sign of Jonah?
Resurrection of Jesus.
All right, give me more. What does he say the sign of Jonah is specifically?
I have to.
As Jonah was, what?
In the belly of the whale
For how long?
belly of the fish for 3 days, so shall the man.
There you go. That's the sign of Jonah. That's in chapter 12.
Could it? I guess my understanding, maybe I've just always thought of this the wrong way, but I always thought that the sign of Jonah was just really that they didn't get a sign other than that he told them to repent, and so I always thought this was him saying, you're not going to get any more sign than Nineveh got, and they repented.
Yeah.
So
No,
that's-
because in chapter 12 he goes on to say that just as, so also will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart or belly of the earth. That's in parallels.
So he's saying their sign's going to be him dying, and
Yeah. So Elber's answer was right. The resurrection is the sign, but the fact that he predicted, I'm going to die, I'm going to be dead for 3 days, I'm going to be resurrected, that is a parallel to what happened with Jonah. So the sign of Jonah. All right, then in verse 5, the disciples came to the other side and had forgotten to take bread. And Jesus said to them, watch out and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. The Pharisees and Sadducees in verses 1 through 4 is what Jesus is referring to, because their insidious, evil hearts and minds were demonstrated by the show us a sign from heaven. And I wondered if that request is because they didn't think he could do it. Oh yeah, he's pretty good at handling the blind and the lame and the sick. But show us something up there. Don't think he can. And of course Jesus refuses to do so, and as they're walking away, they're probably saying, see, told you, you couldn't. So he's warning the disciples to watch out for the leaven of these guys. The leaven is that they have a evil, spreading kind of influence. Their work is something that just has permeated the Jewish society. And it's sad that they've had this kind of clout and this kind of influence. The disciples, though, are thinking physically, not spiritually. They began to discuss among themselves, saying, it's because we took no bread. Jesus is kind of upset. Judas, why did you take some money out of the money box and buy some bread? Well, because there wasn't any money in the money box. Yes.
I was talking about the leaven, and he was talking to his disciples. He wasn't telling them about their way of teaching people, just about how they were, their actions, or kind of confused on that.
Yeah, the power, that they're very influential and need to be aware of
Their influence on others.
Yeah, and it is their teaching, but their teaching is very, very powerful. It's impacting the people, it's spreading to the people. But Jesus, they're saying he's mad at us for not taking bread. Jesus, aware of this, said, "You men of little faith, why do you discuss among yourselves because you have no bread? Do you not understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many large baskets you took up? Or the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many baskets you took up?" Now, he reminds them of 2 very recent miraculous feedings. Jesus isn't concerned about bread. It never was a problem. He wasn't concerned about bread when you got 5,000 hungry men, when you got 4,000 hungry men. See, he calls them men of little faith because they don't believe that Jesus could produce more bread. Or maybe can, but won't. Whatever it is, their faith is not where it needs to be.
You know, you mentioned Mark earlier, And before coming here, I was in a small group where we went through the book of Mark. Mark captures this real well. I mean, he is just like, do you not get it?
Yeah. This may never happen to you, but there was a man at Bear Valley years ago that had kind of been duped into believing the synoptic problem. The synoptic problem is where Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what are called the synoptic gospels, borrowed and stole virtually material from each other. Mark was the first one, and Matthew and Luke stole information from Mark, and then Matthew had his own source, which they call the M source, and Luke had his own source that is called the L source, and then they also had what is called Q, which was from quelle in Latin, which means source. So it's called the four source theory. And so you got Matthew, and he's got 4 different places that he's drawn his material from. From Mark, from M source, from Q, and then from his own originality, which is that much of his gospel. Everything else is stolen material. So if you hear about the 4 source theory, that's what it's talking about. So anyway, this guy, and this is kind of like the Doc Hyde. You write this paper and say, I'm never going to run into anybody that believes any of this stuff. And next thing you know, you'll have what happened to me. I've got a little old lady, 82 years old, that says, well, Moses didn't write this, you know. It's like, where'd you get that?
You tear her up?
Oh, you bet. It was brutal. Yeah, with love.
How did she take it?
She said, I had never heard anybody do anything but say that Moses didn't write it.
Huh.
And so when I went to Bear Valley, I was required to write a Doc Hyde paper. That's how old this is.
Huh.
And I went to school here in 1976.
How are you born?
1975. So, anyway, I was very thankful that I had to write that paper, because that wasn't the only time either that I encountered that. When I went to graduate school, I've got a Christian college professor who's teaching the Doc Hyde, teaching that Moses didn't write this stuff. So you're going to have teens that go to college, and they're going to be introduced to that junk, and you'll know what you're talking about, hopefully. Anyway, the synoptic problem is another one of these things. There are people that just believe that they're borrowing from one another, and they get their facts confused and so on, and say there weren't really 2 miracles, there was just one, and the gospel writers get messed up. Was it 5,000? Was it 4,000? I don't know, but anyway, they got the number wrong. Somebody had it wrong. And I said, are you aware of the fact that in Matthew chapter 16, Jesus makes reference to both miracles? The feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000? And it's like, okay, maybe they didn't get the number wrong. Maybe there actually were 2 separate miracles. And I went, you think? There were 2 miracles. We don't got... The numbers aren't wrong. The number of fish aren't wrong. The number of loaves aren't wrong. It's 2 separate miracles is what's going on. So maybe someday you'll remember learning this in Matthew if you didn't already know. Okay, so Jesus is saying you've got to expand and learn more about faith. His point is, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Then they understood that he did not say to beware of the leaven of bread. Watch out for those loaves of bread, man. You know, it's dangerous. You could choke. What is he talking? Beware of the leaven of bread. I've never really quite got that. The attack of the angry bread loaves. I'm talking about the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. All right? Their teaching is something that is insidious, it's powerful, it's influential, and it is something that is certainly spread throughout the Jewish community. All right, verse 13. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he began asking his disciples a question. Now we're going way up north. Yes?
I had a quick question about the numbers, 4,000, 5,000. Are those to be taken as literally 4,000 and 5,000?
Probably not.
Or just, rounded out numbers?
Round. 30 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. Here's a map. And you can see where we're spending a majority of our time down in Capernaum and Gennesaret and Bethsaida. Now we've gone way up there to Caesarea Philippi. $30 miles. This is the northernmost region that the New Testament records that Jesus went to on that side of the kind of the Sea of or the Jordan River. All right, he asked the question, oh, by the way, this is some pictures that I took. Unbelievably beautiful area. I had no idea what it was going to look like, but it was, you had waterfalls and lakes with unbelievably clear, crystal blue mountain water, and it was just very, very pretty area. Yeah.
I mean, we can only speculate, but why do you think he took the men up there as maybe a little bit of a retreat to get to the crux of the matter?
It's pretty enough that a retreat type area would have been logical, but there are some that have another theory to that, which I'll explain in a minute.
How does your retreat area that you guys went to compare to that?
It was not quite as nice. It's still nice. All right, so here's the question. Who do men say that I am? All right, if you're marking questions in the Gospel of Matthew, circle verse 13. All right, what is popular opinion? All right, we're at this point in Jesus' ministry. Let's do an assessment. Where are we in the minds of men? What are they saying? What's popular opinion about me? As opposed to the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus is not asking, what are the scribes and Pharisees saying about me? Well, you're Beelzebub's worker. That's what that would be the answer to that. He doesn't care about that. They said, some say John the Baptist. Well, we already know that Herod said that in chapter 14 and verse 2. So Herod is probably not the only one that thought that. Some Elijah. Well, we've talked about these texts in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, that there was a prophecy that the Elijah was going to come. We also remember, though, that Jesus, on numerous occasions, said that John was a fulfillment of the Malachi 4 passage. Some say Jeremiah. Well, that is not from an Old Testament text, but from 1 Maccabees 14. First Maccabees is one of those apocryphal books, written about 125, 150 BC. Or one of the prophets. Isaiah was a prophet that we read about, some thinking that there would be a reincarnation of Isaiah, maybe someone else. But when you look at this list, what strikes you as not just what's there, but what's missing? What's missing?
Messiah.
Popular opinion does not have Jesus as the Messiah. Verse 15, and he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" This is emphatic. All right, we know what they're saying. How about you? The disciples had been with Jesus long enough that if honest, and if they were hearing with their ears and seeing with their eyes, they would have been able to form a correct judgment. Are you seeing me the same way as the multitude sees me? Or do you see me differently? And Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Peter's confession here is very significant. First of all, he says, "You are the Christ." This refers to his office. It is not one of his names, like his last name, some people. His name, Jesus Christ. What was Jesus' middle name? He's the prophesied Messiah. When you said, "You're the Christ," Peter is saying, you are the Messiah. You are the one that was prophesied to come. Now that right there would have been a pretty good and, of course, accurate assessment. But Peter is going further. He says, secondly, you are the Son of the living God. Yes.
This may be a little bit of a rabbit, but in the Greek, I'm guessing it doesn't say Messiah.
No.
Was it understood in his language?
Well, Christ is the Greek for Messiah, in Hebrew, the anointed one.
So Christ was not a common name at all?
No, and nobody was called that.
Okay.
Son of the living God refers to his divinity. So Peter, on the one hand, is hitting his office of being Messiah, but now his nature, he's divinity. That goes way beyond popular opinion. Now, the men that were mentioned in verse 14 that were the theories of popular opinion, John, Elijah, Jeremiah, they were all great men. But none of them were qualified to build the church. The only one who's qualified to build the church is the one that has these two qualifications. Now, if you're following that line of reasoning, then Martin Luther was not qualified to build anything. John Calvin was not qualified to build anything. Joseph Smith was not qualified to build anything. Only the Christ, only the Son of God, has the qualifications and the authority to build anything that has to do with the plan of God. And none of those men, the Luthers and Calvins and the Zwinglies and the Joseph Smiths, are anywhere in the same category as a John the Baptist or an Elijah, and those guys weren't qualified. So why is it that men, even now, seem to think that Sun Yin Moon can build a church? You can't. Only Christ, the Son of God, can build a church. And Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonas. You're blessed, approved of God. What you just did, what you just said, God is pleased with that." Bar-Jonas tells us that Peter's dad's name was Jonas. Bar means son. Simon, son of Jonas. Because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. No one went to Peter and whispered in his ear and said, "Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God." No man, no flesh and blood ever said that to Peter. But he got it from God. Now, this does not mean that God revealed to Peter in a dream or a vision. Peter is being complimented by Jesus because he connected the dots. He saw what he saw. He heard what he heard. He witnessed the wonderful miracles of Jesus and said, "This has got to be the Christ. This has got to be the Son of God." Now remember, when Jesus was walking on the water, their conclusion in chapter 14, verse 33, "You are certainly God's Son." So they had already hit on that idea, that he was God's Son. Verse 18, "And I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not overpower it." Now, I want to show you some pictures that I took when we were in Caesarea Philippi. Because there is this cave that is there that has the name Gates of Hell. It is a place where for hundreds of years that predate even the time of Jesus, that there were human sacrifices in this cave. You go in the cave and it kind of goes down into a pit, and human remains have been found in that pit. Now, it's called Pan, or the Arabic is, or it's Pan or Paniah, and then the Arabic rendition is Benaiah. And so if you look on a map, that a modern day map, it'll actually have the name Benaiah on it, and that's the Arabic word for this. The English word panic comes from this place. Pan is the name that was given of this place, the Greek name, and so panic comes from this. Now, I put off Dale because I told him that there was another reason why Jesus may have brought them to this place. Well, some scholars believe that when Jesus said, "And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it," he wanted this as his backdrop. Not that he was saying that that was the gates of hell, but that was a visual, an illustration. But what we don't know is whether it was called this prior to the time of Jesus. There is zero evidence that it was called the gates of hell. As a matter of fact, a majority of scholars believe that it was named this after Jesus talked about the gates of hell on this particular occasion. Now, when I was there, it was being excavated, and you got, like, on the left, bottom left is where the cave is that you just saw the last picture of. And there were all sorts of stones that were a part of ancient shrines and buildings that were found at this particular location. And then on the wall to the right of the cave you can't see anymore, are these grottos that had idolatrous images in them that represented the gods to whom these humans were being sacrificed to. So they would go throw the baby into the pit, and then they would come and they would worship whatever god was represented inside these little carved out grottos. The images are long been destroyed, but the carved out places in the rock where the images sat are still there. Very fascinating place to go see and just think about. Okay, back to the text. He says, "You are Peter." Now, let's talk a little Greek here. When he says, "You are Peter," he uses a Greek word, Petros, which in Greek means a small rock or a pebble. As a child, you pick up off the ground and you let fly a Petros. You are Petros, Peter. But upon this rock, now he uses a different word. Similar, yes. But a different word with a different meaning. Petra means bedrock, foundation rock. You cannot pick this up like you can a Petros. This is the word that Jesus uses in Matthew 7:24. The wise man builds his house upon a Petra, foundation rock. Now, is he kind of playing off of Peter's name? Yeah. Petros, Petra. But you're Peter, you're a Petros. But upon this Petra, I will build my church. Well, what is the Petra that he's going to build his church on? Peter's confession. only the Christ, only the Son of the living God can build a church. That is a solid rock foundation. So anybody else that builds a church is building upon what? Sand. That's not wise. That's dumb. That's foolish. He who hears these words of mine and acts upon them, he's wise. I'm building my church upon a solid rock foundation. All right, then so notice that the word church is, first of all, my. I need to make a new slide on this. I'm on a roll, so better get it down. Stay up with me. You don't have it. But first of all, it's mine.
Say that again.
Yeah. But he's making observation about what he's going to build. It's my church. No one else can have or should have a church. Second of all, the word church has to do with an assembly of people. Now, some say that ecclesia means called out, but it's more of a generic word that has to do with an assembly of people. All right? So Jesus is going to have a group of followers, is what he's saying. And then, third, it's singular. My church. Not churches. Just like Paul in the book of Ephesians is going to talk about the body. There's one body. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. He doesn't have many churches. And so as we think about denominationalism, they can't all be Christ's church. It's impossible. He only has one body. And according to Ephesians 5 and verse 23, he is going to be the Savior of the body. So if you're not a part of the church, the one and only church that Jesus built, you're not saved. Now, you may be a part of a religious organization, but Jesus doesn't know them. He didn't build that organization. You know, we talk about the uniqueness of the church, and that's a message that is very unpopular today. Because we're suggesting that religious folks in these denominations are not saved. Well, it's what the Bible teaches.
Going back to the two Greek words that are used there for Peter and the rock, isn't the one for Peter masculine and the other one's feminine?
One masculine.
So he wouldn't have used the feminine term in referring to Peter and saying he's building the church upon Peter.
Yeah. That makes no sense grammatically.
This is something I've come across, and I was wondering if you'd shed some light on it, is that somebody's told me that obviously we know that, you know, there was Aramaic spoken. They said that Matthew was originally written in Aramaic and then was quickly translated to Greek, and that in the Aramaic there is no gender between the two words, and the two words are exactly the same, and I had never heard that before, and I just didn't know how to respond to that.
I don't. I'm pretty sure that there is gender in Aramaic, but I'd have to research it to know for sure.
Was Matthew originally written in Aramaic?
No, that's the false premise.
Okay.
Matthew was originally written in Greek, and there's no record of it there. Well, see, even that is, there are some say that it was originally written in Hebrew, and then some say Aramaic, but all the evidence points to Greek, and that's all we ever had. Okay, this is a good place to stop. We've got a lot more to say about verse 18, so we'll just save that until next Thursday, because next Tuesday we have our midterm exam. Once again, it's only on chapters 1 through 12. We've covered 13, 14, 15, and half of 16, But none of that is on the midterm, all of that will be on the final. So, when I ask you what chapter is it, don't be saying chapter 13 or 14 or 15,